Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Labriola, and I'm a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. And I am so excited to welcome you to this very exciting event today. This is a one part of the series, the Conversation with the Field series, which, as you know, are conversations about topics critical to the field of deflection and pre-arrest diversion. And today, we're very excited to talk about research. First, I just really wanted to thank PTAC for hosting this wonderful event, all of these conversations, and to our sponsor, Frontline Responders Network. This is quite a team of people who have put these conversations together, and we're very, very lucky. So to get started today, we've put together a video which kind of introduces PTAC in general, and then also about what we're going to a little bit about what we're going to talk about today in regards to research. So let's go ahead and play the video.
The conversations with the field, what are they? This is something new, something very exciting that's never been done for our field of deflection and pre-arrest diversion. We're a very young field, but you've got a place where you can come and listen to folks as well as share with others what you are seeing and doing in a wide range of topics. Deflection and pre-arrest diversion, law enforcement, fire, and EMS are working together to connect people who are in need of substance use disorder and mental health treatment into recovery for themselves, for their families, and for their children.
I think it takes a certain kind of cop to understand and want to instead help. Those are the officers that we're speaking to, and they're not out there to arrest, and they understand that that's not what these individuals need.
Melissa Labriola, PhD, is a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. She has over 17 years of experience directing a number of projects related to court responses to intimate partner violence, specialized courts, including drug courts and domestic violence courts, human trafficking, and prosecutor and police-led diversion.
A lot of these deflection programs have embedded social workers. And so they're not doing it alone. So they're learning so much from the social workers, and the social workers are learning so much from the law enforcement. They're really a team. And I think that's wonderful to see, and that it really takes, both of them out there on the streets in community outreach to actually offer and help individuals. The individual might not be ready for help at that moment, but to know that maybe the next time they will be, or the next time after that, just to always be there. The agencies that are working really kind of on the individual level, whether it be prosecutors' offices or the court system or parole or probation, and with police agencies as well. So I think that trying to come up with a common definition and a common measurement might be a really good first step in terms of getting everyone kind of on the same page in terms of what are we trying to measure, what can we measure. I believe that the research will help them develop and implement and maintain a stronger program. So I think that that's really one of the biggest benefits for agencies to collect this data, because it is a lot of work, and sometimes it's just almost impossible because they're already doing what they're doing and they may not have a data analyst or a data person on staff. So how do they get to that level? But it really will benefit not only the field in terms of learning more about deflection and how deflection can help your community, but it will help them understand where there may be issues in their own program that need help or challenges and barriers. So it really can benefit their own agency as well. I'm currently working on a multi-site evaluation of 6 programs across the country. And right now we are in the process of interviewing law enforcement staff and key stakeholders that are involved in those programs. And these programs are not only helping at-risk individuals, but they're also working very closely with families who may have lost someone to an overdose or have at-risk individuals in their family and they are seeking help. And the success stories that I hear just while, speaking with these people who are involved in these programs are wonderful. They tell stories of, when they first meet an individual and how they may not have wanted help at that moment, but just the consistency and the constant working with that individual and telling them about different services and treatment programs that are available, and and being able to work with them for 6, 9, 12 months, even longer, and having just really great success stories on how much these individuals have, whether they now have a job, whether or not they're reunited with their family, just various outcomes. We know that deflection programs have been increasing all over the country for many years. The lack of research on whether or not they're effective is very minimal. And the research that does exist is very descriptive in nature, which is very important. However, we believe we're getting to the point where the programs are rigorous enough in terms of their own project design and program design and their capability of collecting data that we believe it's time for more rigorous research to be done on whether or not they're effective. I don't believe in doing research in a silo and doing research for my own sake. I really want research to benefit the audience and to benefit the community. These deflection programs are working very hard and sometimes with very minimal resources and coming up with their ideas from scratch on what will, benefit their community. And I just want research to be able to help them. So, at the very minimal, helping sites, whether it be collecting data, understanding what data to collect is often a big challenge. And how to collect the data. A lot of sites don't have the data capabilities. That really gets to the resource issue on whether they have the capacity and the resources to do that, what to collect, how to identify their participants, and how to collect the data regarding their services or their treatment, and to whether they're going to be tracking the individuals in terms of their progress. So really just working with the sites to be able to get them so that they are able to participate in evaluation and to participate in research. Every program that I've worked with and every program that I've spoken to have different goals. A lot of programs, they don't even know how to define what really success means. Sometimes it's just linking people with services, and that's the most that they can do. And they believe that is a huge help, which of course it is. So it's, all the way to, are these programs, reducing recidivism or reducing costs to the community, really, really kind of pretty hefty outcomes that are more difficult to measure, but are also very important. What does the site want to know, and what can they know, and what do they have the ability to work with us so we can help them figure it out?
Well, great. So thank you for watching our opening video. I hope that it provided both an overview of PTAC and what PTAC is trying to do, as well as kind of steer this conversation into the topic of research and all of the challenges that go into research, but how important it is as the field moves forward. So today what we're going to do is we are going to try to cover the major topics today are, establishing program goals, defining measures, developing evaluation procedures, and just collaboration between research and practitioners and how important that is. So we're doing that with myself as moderator and 4 wonderful experts in the field of pre-arrest deflection research. And so we will, just really briefly, our 4 panelists today are Chico Tillman, and he is with the Center for Health and Justice at Task. Jessica Reichert from the Center for Justice Research and Evaluation at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. We have Al Kopak, he's at the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Western Carolina University. And Kelly Firesheets, who's with Core Data. So those 4 panelists and myself, and the way we're going to shape today's meeting will be, we have brief introduction videos that each of the panelists have done. Again, they're talking about their experience with research and touching on some of the topics that we're going to cover in today's meeting. And after a video, we'll open it up to any questions that you all might have. So please use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be monitoring those questions. And if we'll try to answer those questions during each of our segments. And if not, if we don't get to it, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the meeting as well. So we'll definitely get to all of your questions, but please ask questions. We really want this to be an informal almost as much as we can in Zoom, but we really want to hear from you. We want to make sure that we're answering questions that you might have. I think what you'll hear from all of us is how important that we believe research is, and how important we believe doing research with practitioners and with people who are actually on the ground is, to make sure that we're answering questions that are of interest to you, and helping in any way that we can, because we realize that some of these concepts, like defining measurements and finding a comparison group and doing an evaluation, all can be they're difficult. And so let's work together to accomplish these things. So I think that's really what I wanted to make sure to say to begin with. And then if that's all good, I think we can get started with our first video, which will be Miss Kelly Firesheets.
Everybody would say, my program has a 98% success rate. I don't care what the program was. I don't care what it was trying to do. Like, everybody would say, I have a 98% success rate. And some of my colleagues and I, we'd have kind of a running joke about it. Be like, how's that success rate going? You at 98% yet? It just seemed arbitrary, right? And success rate tells you nothing. The folks who've been in this for a while have gotten more clear about okay, what is success? Is success finding people, right, and connecting with them and keeping them engaged in your outreach efforts? That is success. Or is success people completing the first level of care in addiction treatment? Is that success? Or is success people describe themselves as clean and sober for a year? Is that success? They are all valid metrics of success, but I think we've really struggled in this with how much of that we want to take credit for, or also be blamed for when it doesn't go right. I hate that language, but a lot of times that's how we think about evaluation and research.
So it seems to me that maybe some reverse engineering might be the very thing that could serve as a bridge between where we are now, where we might need to be going.
At this point, I think some of the more interesting things in there are smaller questions of human relations and dynamics. I'm really curious about what happened in these pre-arrest deflection programs over the course of 2020 and what we see in the data from our interactions in the field during COVID, right? During this time of stress and social distance, and just what it looks like. We know from the data that overdoses and overdose deaths are up. So we know that fact. But I'm really curious about the data from these programs themselves, especially the ones that have been focused on opioid addiction, to know, are those previously known clients who'd been stable for a long time and they've relapsed? Or are these people who are new to addiction and maybe they've now escalated to opioid use and they're overdosing? Are our socially distant outreach activities as effective as our in-person? Are there ways that they're more effective? Can we learn ways to do this and be more efficient? Are there differences? Are there age differences? Maybe young people respond to texting, right? And older people need an in-person visit. I think there's lots of smaller kind of questions that we now have inside of our program data that we can understand just from the weird natural experiment that was 2020. We can really start to understand more about what makes these programs effective and what elements are important, what you want to make sure you do and what you can let go of. We see that on average, it takes 3 to 4 interactions to get a person to start to agree to receive resources from these pre-arrest deflection teams. They got to go out and say, hey, Jim, how you doing? Hey, how you doing? Hey, how you doing? And then the people will agree. That's a really nice little nugget of information that can be really pragmatic for the programs. And so I think sometimes we get so stuck on the does it work or is it successful or what is the impact that we lose these small pieces of information that can move us all closer towards the goal of engaging people and getting them the care that they need.
So thank you, Kelly, so much. That was very, very helpful and very interesting. So I think that really where I wanted to get started was where you got started, which I think is so important, and how programs define success, and should they be defining success, and how can we make that measurable, and any experience that you've had doing that. So
Yeah, so
it's
I
a
think
three-part question.
it is a three-part question. I think this is one of the hardest parts of this because by function, these programs have a bunch of different partners from a bunch of different places who are accountable for a bunch of different things, right? So you have public safety and public health and addiction treatment and peers and everybody comes into these programs with a different perspective and a different idea of what they want to see happen or why they're doing this work. And I know when I started evaluating these programs, I'm the evaluator. So clearly I know what the outcomes should be and I will tell them and then we will measure them was really how I thought about it. But the more that I've worked in pre-arrest deflection over time, the more I really start to appreciate those different perspectives. And I want the programs to, first of all, hash that out amongst themselves, like really have the hard conversations about what are we here for, right? Are we here to keep people from getting arrested? Are we here to get people in recovery? What does it mean to be in recovery? Are we doing harm reduction? What does that mean? All those real hard questions, right? And then inform me as the evaluator or as the data person, right? So that I can then support that with the data and the information and help them answer those questions and understand those. I don't think in this field we're ever going to say like, this is the single metric of success. I think that we're always going to be kind of collecting information to speak to how this works to a bunch of different stakeholders. And really kind of helping using data and using information to translate and to facilitate a shared dialogue among systems, which is kind of interestingly, right? That's the challenge on the ground. That's the challenge in the evaluation. And then that's just kind of the challenge in our society is we're dealing with people among and between systems. And there is no one thing, it's all of them almost.
Right. No, thank you. And I mean, in my experience as well, it's the measuring of them, which is often speaking to non-researchers, it's often, how do you measure that, and speaking that measurement language? Because like you said, especially if they have a multitude of goals, depending on who you're speaking with, which agency, then they all kind of have to be measured, and that's often difficult.
Yeah, no, it is really difficult. And I think, I came into evaluation and to research from a very clinical perspective as a psychologist. And so, very often I think about metrics of success as being like actual measures of psychological improvement, right? Or of improvement in functioning. And that's not always possible in these programs in the way that they engage people, right? Like literally on the street on a corner. It's real hard to administer a WACE or an MMPI in that environment. And so, I think though we're getting smarter about understanding, I always call them smart proxies for evaluation. And kind of, okay, if we want to look at relational stability, what are some decent proxies of that? And how can we collect those things? I also think that there's always this push and pull between when I want to do research that I'm going to publish and write all the real rich and heavy research, and when I'm evaluating a program to inform and improve it. And I think lots of times we kind of, as the wonky researchy people in the room, it's kind of on us to facilitate that conversation about like, okay, we might do this for the research and that's going to last for 3 years, but let's talk about what you need and how you understand your success in your program in the long run. And that's evaluation. And they're both equally important to you. And we're going to wheel and deal to kind of make, to put something together and put a structure together that will work for the long run, but then also that we can answer some of these robust questions and inform the field today.
Great. Yes. And I loved your comment about the 98% success rate.
It's always 98%. Always.
It's always 98 because you recognize that 100% is too difficult. So
That's
98.
right. 98% is like, we still have room for improvement, just a little.
Right. But it seems like that's a plausible, like that's a goal. That is a great goal that we should all be achieving in all parts of our lives, to be 98% great at something.
Yeah.
So when you actually are working with programs, how is it that you, I don't know, discuss that 98% or discuss, I don't know, realistic type goals?
Well, so I think it depends on how well you know them, right?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, honestly, it depends on how well you know them. And this really is a know your audience thing, because I have found that inside these programs, different sectors, like people from different backgrounds, respond to outcomes in really different ways. And that in and of itself is like fascinating to me. So like, I find that the people from my own background, the treatment professionals, they're a little bit more defensive about these outcomes. Like they get on edge. I think they feel like we're telling them they're failing or that treatment doesn't work. Like there's defensiveness there. Whereas like when I look at or work with people, EMTs, first responder type people, EMTs or law enforcement, they're usually like, yeah. But I think we can look at literature and we understand things like relapse rates for addictions, and so we have to look at these programs, and we know that addiction is a lifelong chronic condition, and that people with any lifelong chronic condition are going to have variations in their sticking to the treatment plan, right? Like a person with diabetes will eat a cookie. That's okay, right? Like a person with addiction will likely relapse at some point in their life. The goal of these is to get people to closer and closer to stability and health over time. And so, a lot of times it's like just a reframing of like, you don't have a pre-arrest deflection program with a person and you're intervening with a person with severe schizophrenia and you send them to treatment and then everything's fine and they like get a job the next day and they work and buy a house and like have a stable family. That lacks an understanding of the context and the disease. So I think a lot of times when you talk about these outcomes, you got to contextualize it in the thing that you're measuring. If I found a pre-arrest deflection program that had like a 98 success rate in like improving every aspect of everyone's life, like if any one of us did, I mean, we'd be rich people, right? That's like, it's not realistic. And so I think really kind of you can't ever separate your data or your research from your real world about like, let's talk about how hard this is. Like it's hard. And figuring out how to honestly understand the success of this program, but also not run into the ground a feeling of defeat because the numbers look low or they look bad. That's, it's a balance, but I think it's got to happen in an ongoing dialogue.
Sure. Great. And I don't think that, and again, this is just a reminder to all of you who are listening, please, if you have any questions about anything, please put them in the chat box. We would love to answer. Before we move on, Al, Chico, Jessica, do you have anything to add regarding program goals or defining success with the programs that you've worked with and the people you've worked with?
I would just say that I usually impress upon folks that are participating to think about their specific kind of pre-arrest or deflection program. Because there's such a wide array of them, we do have a pretty large amount of variation into what we classify as pre-arrest and deflection. So some are on one end of the spectrum designed for folks who may be their first contact with the criminal justice system. And I guess the way that I've conceptualized it is that you have folks on the other end who have experience with severe substance use disorder, who may have a lengthy criminal history, who may have been cycled in and out of the local jail, a dozen times in the last few months for all different kinds of criminal activity, for instance, and everything in between. You have an amalgam. You might have one jurisdiction that's got multiple pre-arrest diversion deflection initiatives taking place all at once. And so not to overcomplicate things, but just to, I guess, tease out some nuance in terms of thinking through what a particular program might be trying to achieve, because then you can sort of identify the best ways to observe those activities.
That's an excellent point, and possibly something we may have started with, actually. So thank you for bringing that up. Just that there is no, one size of any of these programs. That they're, they could be built up organically within these agencies, and they can look completely different depending on the population which they're trying to serve. And we've really seen the gamut of them in terms of that. So thank you very much.
And I'd like to add, in terms of measuring success, I really like to work with programs to create a logic model, which can show what are the inputs, what are the resources, what are the activities of the program, and then what are the short-term and long-term goals, and really make it an interaction between me and them to develop something together with all the stakeholders of the program to kind of get something down that we all think is appropriate, that are short and long-term goals, because sometimes the goal is too lofty, that you're never going to achieve no substance use disorders or something like that. So just something like, what can this program realistically do, and what are the things we can work towards getting it, and then think about, okay, now that we know that, how can we decide how we're going to measure that? So I think
that's excellent. Yes, and we're actually about to move into the evaluation part. So, and that's because I agree. I think that's always, not only for me, but helps me understand the program in which I'm working with, but I think it helps them understand that it is this kind of like, A to E, what are the inputs that you're putting into this? How are you measuring it? And what do you expect to come out of it? It's always a nice exercise to get everyone on the same page. Okay. So I think for that, not that we're going to stay away from goals, but I think let's play this second video, which is actually Jessica, we'll talk more about evaluation.
Hi, I'm Jessica Reichert. I'm the Acting Research Director at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. We're a state government agency that administers grants, federal and state grants, for criminal justice, victim services, and violence prevention. And we also have a large research unit. And myself and other researchers have been examining deflection programs. And the grant side has been funding several deflection programs in Illinois. We have the second deflection program in Illinois. We also have several other programs that have started in the state. Most of them are the self-referral programs, where individuals walk into a police department asking for help, and then they give them a referral to treatment. Illinois has passed legislation on deflection, authorizing the use of those programs, also putting some state money towards them. And recently, there's legislation to expand it a bit further, including not just police, but also first responders. So our state has a good start on these programs. While I've been researching deflection programs, some of the research has uncovered many issues and challenges that can affect deflection programs. This can include limited resources and funding, sometimes a lack of transportation to treatment and services, especially I studied one program that was in a rural area, and that was an issue. There may be some racial inequities in program access and outcomes, and also societal stigma attached to drug use would also affect deflection programs. Two of the main ones that come to mind have to do with insufficient treatment capacity. as more programs evolve and a public health model is kind of adopted instead of just arresting people all the time for drug use, there can be limited capacity for treatment and there could be waiting lists. Those things kind of have to be addressed and figure out ways to handle it when people can't immediately get into treatment even though they're ready to. And another issue is police culture that has traditionally relied on arrests and now is trying to take a different approach. And there may be varying viewpoints and acceptance of that among police. So that's another thing that kind of needs to be thought about as well. There could be training, there could be having champions was one thing I found in my research was really helpful in a department. So a chief and those on the higher levels of management and administration and policing really believing in this and trying to let the other officers know how important it is and how it will actually make their job easier can help, move things forward and sort of change that police culture. I found in my research that collaboration piece is very important, including not just the treatment providers and the police, but also the community and other stakeholders who are really invested in helping the people in their community get the help they need. Fortunately, I've seen a lot of collaboration and it's been wonderful to see that people are working together on these programs. It's so great that PTAC is there because this is such a new area for police and first responders and not having a place to go for technical support, webinars, trainings, information. It would be really detrimental to the field if PTAC wasn't there. So there's a place for all these new programs to go to collaborate, to talk to each other, to learn from each other. And I think it's just great that it's there as a resource. I think in order to get more research, it really comes down to resources. I know I'm on a National Institute of Justice grant with others to examine 6 different sites of police deflection. That was one small effort by the Department of Justice to fund research, but there just needs to be more state funding and more federal funding, maybe foundations wanting to look more at deflection. I think there's a lot of interest in deflection and keeping people out of the system and helping them in other ways than arrest. So I know the interest is there. We just need to put some resources to getting more research done. RAND is the lead on the grant, and then ICEJA, my agency, and TASC are also involved. And we're all working together to first look at a number of different sites around the country. We've done interviews to find out more about all of them to sort of narrow down the 6 that we're going to end up looking at. We haven't selected those yet, but once we do that, we're going to rigorously evaluate them for a couple years, and ultimately we'll have a good report on lots of different sites and how they do their work and how their work has impacted the clients and the community.
Thank you, Jessica. And yes, so the study that Jessica was referring to was also the study that I was referring to in my intro. And so together with Chico and TASC, we are working on the multi-site evaluation funded by the Department of Justice, which is very exciting. But you're right, in regards to these evaluations, one big challenge is, receiving and gathering this funding. So other challenges that you would like to speak to? So I know you've done research in this area for a while. How about data? How do you, because I think one thing we're learning from our current work is that not much can be done without the data, and that often is a struggle.
Yeah. and I'm sure Kelly can speak to this as well, being also a data person, but there's always challenges. Often we are asked as evaluators to come in kind of later after our program's already running, and I know Kelly's nodding her head about this already, but you never know what kind of data they're collecting. Post-its, notebooks, Excel spreadsheets, or maybe they even bought some software. And there's, without a researcher maybe being a part of that, oftentimes it's not all the data that you might need, and it's hard to to go back. So you have to kind of maybe change things going forward. Maybe people have already invested in whatever software or whatever they're doing, so it's hard to make changes. And then this is a referral program, so people are referred to treatment, and then treatment data is protected data and really hard for researchers to get access to. I tried many times to get treatment data for one of the programs I was evaluating, and I just got no's. And then one program I was evaluating, I was fortunate to get the data, but it was a real hard struggle. And I get that this data needs to be protected because it's sensitive data and health data about people, but we also need research to know if these programs are effective. So it can be a real challenge in that way. And thinking up front about maybe waivers for clients to sign that you can use my information for research purposes only. I understand that'll be protected and things like that. Those things can happen, but yeah, data is a challenge.
And you mentioned police culture in a different aspect, but I was wondering in terms of permission or accessibility. Again, getting kind of that approval from the higher ups. Was that also a part of, or have were they willing? The programs willing to be evaluated, or did you have to?
Yeah, fortunately, the programs I evaluated, I was asked to do them, approached, because it was really great. They were really interested in knowing how their program was doing, how it was operating. So my experience for the couple programs I've looked at already, it wasn't an issue, but I definitely can see some departments, just like with, I think Kelly touched on this. Some people are, maybe a little apprehensive, I'll say, about researchers coming in, the scrutiny, you're just going to say what I'm doing wrong. And that also comes with being a good collaborator, trying to explain, I'm not trying to slam your program. I'm not going to just focus on what you're doing wrong. In every evaluation I've ever done, deflection and a lot of other programs, there's always good. I think everyone's pretty much always well-meaning and trying to do something positive. And there's always room for improvement. So I think you just build that relationship and you're part of the team and let them know that, I'm doing this to be a benefit to you and be a part of the team.
Right. Yeah, I always find the messaging at the beginning is very, they're long. Evaluations are long. They take a long time. And I think, and it's often frustrating because of course everyone wants to know the answer right away. And it's even surprising to me how long research takes. Sometimes by the end of a research project, I'm, I can't believe I'm still looking at the same research question. So telling that, and then also all of the data that's going to be needed, and really trying to explain methods that we need a comparison group. So that's something that we're struggling with our current project is, especially some of these self-referral programs or maybe some of the more informal deflection work. It's really hard to find that, a comparison group. But you were lucky in the evaluation you did. Who was your comparison group?
So we were fortunate to get the treatment data. So we compared people who were referred to the same treatment provider from the police or by other means to see how the outcomes were. We found that they were similar, which I think is good. So
yes, that's a great question. So Kelly, I know I saw you nodding your head a lot, and you obviously work with data. So do you have more to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I work with data because I had such a hard time getting data, and I sort of became myopically focused on like there has to be a way to solve this problem. I do think building on the treatment issue, because we see this a lot. I think we work with. I work with a couple of state projects, big, federally funded state projects. And there is this desire to know, did people get to treatment, right? Like we have these interventions and did people get to treatment? And treatment data are hard, particularly when you're looking at addiction, because they are subject both to HIPAA and CFR 42. And I've gotten to the point now I tell people, the intent of CFR 42 is to prevent sharing addiction treatment information. Like that's the actual intent of that law. And so as on the research side and the data side, if you're finding that it's next to impossible to get that information, that's because the law is designed that way, to make it next to impossible to share that information. I think we're starting to think creatively about collecting that information directly from people rather than going to treatment providers, so getting some self-report information so that we can start to understand it. It's not the same, right, as getting a confirmation from the treatment provider. But it's one of those places where pulling these data across systems, there are really different rules about how data can be shared and used. And all of those worlds come together in pre-arrest deflection. And so we've got to be kind of nimble and agile in understanding who can do what, setting appropriate expectations at the onset. And then when we run into barriers, I think get creative about how to find information in different ways.
So that's interesting about the being creative. I like the artfulness of that. And then Jessica's suggestion about the waivers as well. Would like any suggestions on how to get past that other than collecting it on your own? I mean, is there any kind of way to go around it? I don't want to violate any laws. But
Well, I mean, you can negotiate. So a lot of our pre-arrest deflection programs, especially our more mature ones, are doing a client consent, right? So you can negotiate a client consent. If you're requesting HIPAA information specifically, you're going to want to make sure that you have your health system entities or your covered entities kind of engaged in the development of that consent, so you make sure that you're meeting their requirements. I used to always grumble about HIPAA. Now I kind of think HIPAA is easy. CFR is really tricky. Like CFR 42 is really tricky because it's scary to treatment providers, and so they tend to interpret it very conservatively, maybe more than they have to. But they can do that, and I totally support that. But also because the rules around the consent are much more specific. And so it's just harder to get those information back. I'm actually looking at one of the questions where she says, are client reported measures valid enough to show progress? And that's why we're kind of moving towards client report, is because we can get the information without going through the treatment providers. I've seen people negotiate ROIs to get that treatment information. It's not impossible. I've seen it done, but it's hard. And quite bluntly, I expect it to become more challenging given our current cultural conversation about law enforcement, because I think there's going to be more hesitancy to share information to a law enforcement involved program. There's more sensitivity about this now. So it's possible. It's very challenging. It requires a lot of negotiation with individual treatment entities to meet their criteria. Whether client reported measures are valid enough or good enough, I think depends on your audience and what you're trying to do, and what questions you're trying to ask. There may be some situations where we want and need to validate that. I think there are other situations where we can ask a person, hey, did this work for you? And we feel pretty good in accepting their answer. So that goes back to how are you going to use this information and who's asking for it and why?
Sure. And if there's available tools out there that can help.
Yeah.
You do.
But you know, I mean, I in a lot of times and places, it's probably not worth the effort or angst to negotiate ROIs. Is it possible? Yeah. Do you really need to do that? I
Sure.
think that's a real question to ask, because it's time and it's energy, and that's, you know, work that you're doing that's not focused on the clients or other things.
Right. Thank you. Al, Chico, anything to add just regarding this kind of this overarching evaluation topic area? Chico, because I know you're involved in our program as project as well. You're on mute.
When I walk into a space as a researcher, the most important thing I try to convey to the organization or the institution that we're doing research with is that we're trying to capture the great work they're doing. So I think that is a key tone setter, by letting them know, hey, we're partnering with you not only to capture the great work that you're doing, but to be able to tell your story through qualitative methods, and also be able to talk about the impact you're having. And that's how we do it quantitatively. We want to say how many people you're touching and how. And I think when you begin to talk to people about that, they're more transparent about the work they're doing. And we come in and we say, we want to know, we don't know, you're the expert. Those are some of the things we impress upon them, that we want to learn about what you're doing and be able to tell your story accurately. And I think that when you get to describing it like that, people are more freely to give data, and we get to tell them why data is important, that data truly tells the story, and we're not creating the editorial or commentary. We're just allowing the data to tell the story of the great work you're doing, particularly in deflection, because it's such an emerging field and people want to learn about the great work you're doing so they can replicate it. So that's the thing. I think we've done a great job doing a national research project along with RAND and ICESIA, is letting them know that, hey, we want to learn about the great work you're doing so other departments can get on board and begin doing great work as well. And the last thing is, we tell them the things we critique is so you can modify it and make it better. Because we want to let you know what's not working or where there might be some challenges so you can fix it, not to be critical of the work you're doing, because we understand how the toil that comes to the work, and we appreciate it as well.
Oh, thank you. Yes, yes, because you're right. Sometimes we get into the nuts and bolts of how to do a evaluation, but right, without that partnership at the beginning and right, developing that partnership at the very right, we were very slow in the study that we're doing to contact these sites, and really, because we're, often was just cold calling, explaining, what we wanted to do. And so it was very important, obviously. Al, in case you want anything to add, otherwise we can go on to your section. Do you want to just go on? Okay, so let's play Al's video, and then we'll talk more about measurement.
I became interested, as a lot of people do, in substance use due to family history. I have many family members who are in recovery, different points, even more recently, have struggled in ways that I think a lot of us can understand. I've had a very close family member experience fatal overdose, and that was just a couple of years ago. And he's my age, with kids the same exact age as mine. So those are the personal reasons that I'll always not only have an interest, but this is kind of, I guess, a calling in some ways, and we all feel sort of led to do certain things, and this one's mine. Working with local law enforcement to sensitize both the criminal justice system and the community to the needs of folks with substance use disorder is in a local county just over the mountain ridge from where I live. And the sheriff basically acknowledged the fact that he knew that substance use disorder was driving a lot of the criminal activity in his jail population, but he couldn't prove this because he just didn't have any information. So we put together a really small pilot project to collect some information for him. And over the course of, well, it's been almost 6 years now, this ongoing relationship, and we've delivered him all sorts of different kinds of information. But the short of it is that there have been new programs that have opened in this county. The sheriff has been spotlighted by national organizations and institutes focused on social justice for his work advocating for the needs of community. And so for me, it just shows the power and the influence that good information can have, especially if it gets into the hands of folks that are eager to do well by their communities.
What do you say to the people that say, it's not that bad? It's really not that bad.
Well, I can relate too, because where I live here in Western North Carolina, it is a craft beer culture. And so Asheville being the nearest larger city, it's not that big by comparison, but has actually had the dubious distinction of being Beer City USA a number of years and competes with other more populated areas that have a huge density of craft breweries. So that's kind of the culture around here, right? It's that you can enjoy, however we want to put it, responsibly or in moderation or what have you. But when one of the city's most prominent selling points is come here and do a pub crawl, that's a very different message than come here and taste this unique beer. It's more like, go and taste all of the beers in one sort of outing. And so, we have to combat that. And then on the flip side, when we do collect our information with our partners in local jails, right, we see that alcohol is a huge driver of repeated jail admissions, recidivism, a variety of different types of offenses. Some of them are, of course, driving under the influence, but others in the more, they're all insidious, but one of the most insidious is violence. There's a very established connection there between high levels of alcohol consumption and violence. So trying to deliver that and as a counterpoint to what we see in a more positive light is challenging. But I think that once people understand the nature, the effects that we have to manage in the background, right? A lot of people just don't want to acknowledge the fact that what is billed as having a good time can also contribute to something negative and is quite pervasive. But once they do realize that, I think you catch their attention because the numbers are stark. And I found too, especially most recently, that they do speak for themselves. We're not talking about narrow margins here. We're talking about pretty large discrepancies between folks that pass through jails on multiple occasions and those who come and go just one time, an extended period. People don't want to necessarily hear about this, but at the same time too, concern builds, especially ironically, right? Maybe it's a product of the craft beer industry, but these craft breweries want to be good stewards of the community. So they've somehow occupied this weird place where they're encouraging consumption because that's their business. But at the same time, they want to invest in the community in all the different kinds of ways that they can advocate for them to be a friend, endearing to the community in all these different kind of ways. So it's, I think a lot of it, to basically get to the bottom line, is that understanding these relationships between all of the entities involved is critical. If you bring the information with the intent of trying to help everybody involved, it seems to be well received. I think it's when we come with the sort of offensive mindset to try and put one organization against another in that regard, that's when problems seem to emerge.
Thank you. Very much. And although I want to sit and actually talk about the craft beer culture, we will talk instead about collecting the measurements. So, like Jessica was talking about, thinking about that logic model. I think that we talked kind of about the front end, about what's needed to have a successful program potentially, and what an evaluation is looking for in terms of that. And we looked at the kind of the end in terms of outcomes and what are possible outcomes and what's actually measurable. And you could have a very lofty goal, but how do you actually measure that in an outcome measure? So kind of talking about in the middle there, because I really like your work with the local jail populations and with the sheriff's office. Did you have to work with them in terms of, right, kind of those middle performance measures? What are their key indicators? Well, I guess, what were your key performance indicators? Were they already collecting them? Did you kind of have to help them in that way?
The short answer is yes. So from the way I've gotten involved with different pre-arrest and diversion and deflection programs and our jail populations, those are kind of two distinct areas that I've worked in, but they all work toward this really neat common goal of just trying to prevent people from being processed too deeply into the criminal justice system. And so in terms of the rural jail populations, it's become really interesting because these are folks, and again, in a rural context, it's a lot different than where a lot of these large named and recognized deflection programs operate, right? Most of those are in medium to large metro areas, but the nature of the population served is the same. And so I've kind of noticed that here in our local communities. And we've been laying the groundwork essentially, so you can imagine starting from a completely blank slate. Literally, these communities don't have any of these programs. I mean, they've heard of them, maybe. So, I mean, it's a completely different starting point than, for example, other work in, who knows, you can name, all the different places where these programs are being well developed and are already being refined. So there's that. And then there's this other area of trying to simply keep folks that have been essentially arrested for the first time for low-level offenses from being processed into the criminal justice system. To me, it's really interesting. Two completely different populations. One more likely than not has severe substance use disorder. The other one more likely than not does not. But we know that being processed into the criminal justice system can still have massive adverse consequences that last for years and years, maybe even a lifetime, depending. And if we just take employment, for example, the research shows that it could take up to 20 years for somebody to reach the same level of employability with a single arrest than their peers without that arrest. And so trying to work between these two to document the needs of both populations with the ultimate goal, again, of eliminating the reliance on the criminal justice system. And so it's been quite challenging, but the common thread between them that sort of compels the work is the receptivity of the criminal justice leaders in these communities. And they're looking for different ways to do everyday routine, what have become routine activities. And so in terms of measuring these things, the kind of whole point I'm trying to get at here is we look at things like the number of people processed into the jail. Because even again, if you're looking at people with severe substance use disorder who've been arrested 39 times in 3 years, which I'm citing a realistic case, our local law enforcement authorities don't want that person going back to the jail. They just draw down resources, and we can make it a financial budgetary issue, which is really important, but it also draws down deputies' time, draws down days of this person's life that they can actually use to initiate and sustain recovery. And so does the other program for first-time offenders, right? To book that person into the jail for a seemingly insignificant offense draws down resources in the same way. So despite the very different kinds of approaches that those programs take, one common example of a measure that might be used is the number of jail days for these populations. And so for me, it takes a lot of intellectual work to try and figure out exactly how these programs are supposed to impact the criminal justice system, because I will not argue that there's many individual level indicators of program responsivity in terms of initiating recovery, sustaining recovery, number of days that drugs have been used and all of this. But I think a lot of the driving force and what has so much momentum behind these programs is how they reduce or change the way that the criminal justice system responds to different kinds of activities. And so I think about impacts on jails. I think about impacts on district attorney caseloads. If we're trying to minimize processing, we should hopefully draw those down so that way we can reallocate district attorney case investigation time for more serious offenses and things like that. But again, kind of referring back to the earlier point that I made, that these are a lot of times program specific, and a lot of times that our local criminal justice leaders have ideas about what they want to achieve. And it's a matter of figuring out the best ways to document whether or not a certain initiative is achieving what it is that they're set out to do.
Exactly right. I think no, perfect. Thank you. And I think that's a huge challenge, right? Try how to document, right, and whether or not you have the capability of doing that. So you actually brought up something really interesting about how you're lucky that you live in an area where the criminal justice leaders are interested to think about these issues in a different way. Is that a newer? Have you seen a kind of a flow of that? Because I mean, I think all of us probably on this call can, just being on the call shows that we're seeing that kind of flow as well. And I was just wondering, do you have a why? Is it like they're tired of seeing the same people over and over again, recognizing they're not helping them at all? Is it a funding, just with increasing caseloads and jail budgets and things like that? A little bit of all of that?
A little bit of all of that. But to be honest with you, I think, and I don't know how much of the variation that this explains if we're talking regression models, but in terms of police culture, we mentioned that earlier. What's really interesting to me in my work with both first-time offender pre-arrest diversion and other types of initiatives is that it's receptivity. So it's law enforcement officers' willingness to use the new, if we want to put air quotes around that, use the pre-arrest diversion option. Because I've seen large metro agencies where you only have a handful of officers that are issuing the citations and doing the diversions. And on the flip side, for the more severe substance use cases that get cycled through the jail, those are larger level administrative decisions that come through the culture of high level county officials talking to each other and sharing that they have similar problems and finding out that there are other ways to address those problems and basically collaborating amongst themselves. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, and it's not something unique to small rural areas, but it is something that I notice more in small rural areas compared to larger metro areas, is this sort of casual collaboration where people are more likely to phone each other up and ask questions about how they did this and how they did that, versus more formalized networks that I think are offered in other places.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think Chico and I are definitely noticing that in our interviews about how, these officers who are dedicated to the community outreach or diversion program, how, they never thought they would be doing this, say 10 years ago, or how the whole culture of the police agency has changed with how they look at even this option. Chico, do you have anything to add about?
Yeah, one of the interesting things we've discovered is once people were introduced to this deflection process and seeing the results of it, seeing individuals' lives actually change, it changed their perspective on how they approach a situation. And in many cases, as we are aware, with the opioid crisis and different situations, different SUDs emerging throughout our country, also it's impacted our law enforcement, because law enforcement historically had high levels of alcoholism. So they can relate. It's a relatability factor that lies there when they're able to see individuals who are engaged in what could be seen criminogenic behavior based upon this disease. So that's what it allowed them to see, and they're able to humanize them. And really, it's amazing when you hear people talk not only about the work, but their passion for the work and how it, in many cases, changed their lives in law enforcement. And they have become the biggest advocates within a lot of time the departments, because when we talk to them, they light up. They start talking about the deflection process and how it's impacted not only lives, but communities. And it's bridged the gap too between this industry, which we call community health providers, and law enforcement, because now they're able to work collaboratively to bring about change in the community.
Right. Yes. No, thank you. Yeah, it's true. They talk about, like, it's like, of course, this is how we should be doing it. You know, we never would have thought of this, and right, this is just such a more efficient and effective way of policing, and it's been great. Kelly, do you have anything that you want to add before I see a lot of head nodding?
Yeah, I think that has also been my experience working with law enforcement. I regret over the course of my career working with these programs that I hadn't been more intentional about measuring that culture change specifically, because it's so obvious when you watch it happen. And I wasn't intentional about that early on. I was just thinking, just Friday, I had a colleague call me who's in law enforcement, and he said, when I picked up the phone, the first thing he said was, you know, this whole time I've been doing police reform, but you didn't tell me that's what I was going to be doing. And I was like, well, I didn't really think of it that way back then, but you're right. We've been doing police reform this whole time and we didn't even know it, because we were so singularly focused on the goal of helping this really challenging population of people. But over the course of, 5 to 7 years of doing this, it's police reform, which is kind of amazing to watch.
Sure. Yeah. And when you put it within the larger context of, the prosecutors are doing, similar work, and the court is doing similar work. And it's nice to see reform happening, a much needed reform happening across the system.
Absolutely.
So let's see, 207, let's play Chico's video, and then we're going to talk about partnerships.
It's critical to be able to look at the research, because the research is what allows us to see what's working, what's not working, and how we can improve those things that are working. Research allows me to see the impact and also the things that might be detrimental to communities. And this is particularly important when we look at our most vulnerable communities, because many times they are offered services without the research being wrapped around it, and we don't really know how beneficial it is. So it allows us to see what's beneficial and ultimately scale that. And that's the big thing we want to be able to do. If something's working, we want to be able to allow other people to utilize it so it'll work well in their communities as well. That's how I look at research. Research allows you to see the best in programming and to share that information. It allows us to not only see the best, but it stops an individual who may follow in that particular field, or another city or space that might follow in that field, from not making the same mistakes as the first person as well. And also it allows us to measure it, which can be real cost efficient, because we might be doing some things that's superfluous, that's not really necessary. And so it allows us to see what's necessary, what's not, and what's most important, so we can focus on those things. And that's why research is critical. And it helps the practitioner better understand their job because now they know, oh, I need to put a little bit more emphasis around this because this is the tool in my toolkit that allows me to be most effective. Quantitative research allows us to measure, to see how many people we're reaching, how impactful it is, how to evaluate. But the qualitative research helps us understand the why. It gives us the rich details, as you spoke about, that's in different populations so that we have cultural sensitivity and competency in learning how to deal with each population. It allows us to learn what's stigmatizing and what's not. It helps us understand how they like to be referred to. So we can learn how to reach individuals who are suffering from SUDs by doing research, by asking the right question. And research is really one thing if you really think about it. Research can be summarized by the question, because that's what research is. It's a question and us taking different methods or different approaches to find the answer. And when you think about it, anything you want to know, at the root of it is research, because you formulate this question in your mind, and by learning how to do research, you learn the different pathways to find the answer to the question.
And you also teach police to ask different questions.
Exactly. So it deepens our understanding and in turn can change our practices. Many people talk about some of the strife or the challenges that we faced in 2020 between police and community. It can be solved in one way, in my opinion. And that's by the humanization of police and the humanization of community. But as long as the conversation is predicated based upon me looking through a lens, whether that lens is community or that lens is policing, then I start the conversation in a space that's adversarial. Community is a label and police is a profession, but both are people. So if we come into a space as people, then we could talk about anything and we will have shared experiences. Because even if you think about it, every police officer either knows someone or has a relative that suffered from an SUD. You know, we're 6 degrees of separation. So everybody knows somebody that's been through this experience, this disease. So if you center the conversation around humanizing both police and community, you take the adversarial aspect out of the room and two people can just sit down and talk. It's critical that we recruit or make space for individuals to do research who come from vulnerable communities, because lived experience and cultural competency and cultural sensitivity is invaluable. A person doing research, for example, that has a law enforcement background on police, he's gonna be able to not only get more information out of police, but he's gonna be able to decipher when they're being forthright and truthful and when they're not telling the truth. So it's critical also that we get individuals to do research who have backgrounds or experience with the vulnerable population we work with, so that they would be able to have deeper conversations and be able to pull things out that a researcher without those experiences won't be able to pull out. Lived experience allows me to create a safe space for us to be able to talk about things, and it creates a level of comfortability that's not there when you have no point of reference. You're not going to talk about something if I have no idea what you're talking about. Because the toughest part about research, which people don't often mention, is access to the population. So it's not the science, because the school teaches you the skill. The hardest part about doing research is access to the people you want to do the research with or on the participants. So when you got access to the research, you're going to get more details. It's going to be more value, more true, more sincere, as opposed to individuals doing research who don't have a point of reference or don't have a connection with the subjects. They use the term subjects or participants, but I like to say people.
Thank you, Chico. That was great. That was, it was such a wonderful way to kind of end our videos, in regards to working as researchers and who should be on our team, what should researchers be made up of, as well as kind of connecting with whether it be law enforcement agencies or other treatment providers, or really just, whoever the research is connecting with. So thank you. You got pretty deep there a little bit. I appreciated that. So could you describe some of your, really what you were speaking of, like when has that worked, when has that not worked? And even if it's not maybe something that you experienced, but maybe that you know of.
Yes. I think many things in life that we view as a detriment or negative in the space of research sometimes becomes an asset. And I say that because I grew up in a vulnerable community, the Austin community, a community where I don't want to use the word drug infested, but it was a lot of crime, a lot of opioid use, a lot of stimulant use. It was a lot of drugs sold in that community. So with that being said, I've witnessed a lot of individuals personally who've had overdoses. I have relationships and family members who were addicted to drugs. And also, I've seen the other side of it. I've seen the process that an individual and the challenges that an individual goes through in recovery. Also, my dad, who is deceased, suffered from an SUD. He suffered from opioid misuse, or so there is a connection for me when I talk to individuals, and even when I come into a space, I'm able to humanize them and see them as people, because I've experienced people in my life who've had those same challenges. And it allows me from swaying from being stereotypical in a way that might demonize them, because I understand the challenges that individuals go through. And I understand the uniqueness of this struggle, that two individuals can start at the same time. One individual can stop tomorrow, but it may take the other individual a lifetime in recovery and all type of supports to stop. So I understand the uniqueness of it. So I go in empathetic as opposed to sympathetic, and I go in seeking understanding of how I can support. And when I do research, I explain to them that I'm coming to learn in order to help others who are on a similar journey as you. And I think that brings them peace, not to come to be critical of your journey, in particular when we talk to individuals. And also when I talk to service providers, whether it be in law enforcement or it be in the community, I tell them I'm coming to learn, but also to assist you, to give you a clearer picture of the work you're doing, so you can see, hey, yeah, I never looked at it like that. Maybe I need to increase this, or maybe I don't need to do this. And I help them be more effective. And I think that's where that partnership come in as a research. I'm here to help you with the work and make it plain before you, because I understand your time is consumed doing the work that you don't have the time to analyze the work you're doing. So I analyze it for you and help you create a narrative for it so you can articulate it.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing. And Al, you too. Thank you both for sharing, like, kind of, why and how you got into this and how you're passionate. Because I do think it's important. I think in the past, research was supposed to be seen as this, we come in where we have no prejudice, we have no bias, we have no agenda. And I think what we're realizing is we all recognize we are all coming into this with something and recognizing, right, how can that benefit? So, bringing on people with different backgrounds and different experiences. And you talked about it in terms of really being able to speak to who are the research subjects or the participants or the people. But I've really seen it to be helpful when you're even at the beginning of a research, or developing the research question and developing instruments. Like, am I asking this the right way? Am I asking the right questions here? Am I using common language? Those types of, so really for the whole entire project. So thank you.
Yeah, I think objectivity is critical throughout the whole process. So I understand too what biases I'm bringing into a space, and I create these parameters to check my biases, so that truly the data can emerge. What we find can emerge, and it can dictate the story, and not what I think or what I feel. But as a researcher, I acknowledge, how I feel and who I am as I come into a space. But I think the critical piece, which we all do, and a lot of people misunderstand us, is we come into a space to learn.
Great. Al, I wanted to follow up on something that you said about during your research, programs emerged based on, so it was like I guess I'm questioning, did you provide findings and that made, agencies either change what they were doing or implement something different? I guess I'm trying to just to say, how has evaluations with this partnership and with this collaboration, enacted change instead of just doing research so we can write a report and put it up on a shelf?
Yes, so that's exactly what happened, is that we initiated a collaborative relationship with a local law enforcement agency who, as we all know, I think if we have experience working with law enforcement agencies, that what they see every day gives them this experience to guide kind of how they make their decisions on a regular basis, like we all do. And so when we started chatting with them, we're like, yeah, we can pretty much validate what you're seeing and document this in a useful fashion. And so that's what we did, is we basically just went in and described the nature of the problem and got some prevalence rates for the specific substance use disorders among the jail population. And that was taken to the county commission. It was used to initiate a transitional housing center proximal to the jail, which is really important too. So much so that people could actually walk there. They didn't even have to worry about transportation in that regard. But it's also been used to start a pre-arrest deflection program for folks who suffer from severe opioid use disorder. Syringe exchange program was started after this was initiated. And all those programmatic activities happened after, like in sequence. And so we were talking earlier about the idea that a lot of times, and this has happened to me too, that as researchers, we get called, halfway through the project, and it's like, hey, all of a sudden now we need to document what we've been doing for the last year and a half. And there's a place for that. But at the same time, it was really cool, and still is, to be invited to the table every time there's a decision to be made, and to be asked about what information might be available that could help guide that decision process. And so it's rare, I would say, in my many years of doing research. It's one of the few. times that's happened, but it's also a really exciting one.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think to Chico's point, if you can get them involved, if you can really develop this partnership and collaboration at the beginning, then and all the way through, then it really is a more fruitful for everybody at the end of it. Kelly, Jessica, or even Chico, if you have more to add, any other, we have about 6 more minutes and I'm watching the Q&A. So if anyone has questions, please, please put them up. But Kelly, Jessica, Chico, any more examples of kind of how research has either challenged or benefited or with specific agencies?
I would love for somebody to talk about also the importance of research influence on funding and on policy, how it guides policy and funding. And that's what really legislators look toward. What does the research say around something, and why it's so critical to get the work you're doing evaluated?
Yeah, so real quick, Jessica had mentioned the idea that Illinois has a state bill. I forget the number, but I can actually look it up. It's like, I don't know, I forget the number. Anyhow, but that's where PTAC comes in, because PTAC was the platform to start having those higher level policy discussions. And you've got a lot of policy leaders that are connected to this organization. And a very similar set of events happened in Florida. So Florida is another state that's got a statewide legislative framework specifically identifying pre-arrest diversion and the idea of data collection and evaluation at the state level.
Oh, that is excellent. And right, and then PTAC being just a great example of having the, often having just the access or, to have the research. Because again, if it's in a journal article, I'm not sure who all is reading those journal articles, but having that avenue to be able to present our research and present the findings to people who it actually matters what it's saying, whether it be legislatures or programs. I think I have a question. Jessica mentioned that racial inequalities may contribute to challenges for diversion and deflection programs. Could you share more, including how research might help address these inequities? And it's true, I wrote down access to justice and based on what you said. So do you have more to share? Because that is a big issue.
I just see it as an area that still needs to be researched with deflection. Officers have a lot of discretion. They make decisions on a lot of times who they're going to offer it to. So there's that potential that certain officers, whether it's conscious or unconscious bias, are offering it to certain people over others. I haven't seen research specific to deflection on that area, but I think that would be something that should be explored to see if that is happening and figure out ways, if it is happening, what can be done to reduce that, whether there is evidence-based trainings or other things that could, or even just pointing it out that it's there, that they may not realize is there, would be helpful, and just have a discussion about it, that it might be something happening.
One of the examples that is pretty top of mind for me, many of the pre-arrest deflection programs, especially in Ohio that I work with, started out of the opioid epidemic, and they were overdose response programs. And we worked with a lot of partners around the greater Cincinnati area to get COPE grants when they were called COPE grants, however many years ago that was, right? And COPE has gone through BJA's gone through many iterations now with these programs. We called them quick response teams or overdose response teams, right? But it's the naloxone plus model of pre-arrest deflection. There's a really interesting side effect of the environment and the funding, which is that all of that COPE funding was opioid specific money, which meant that the programs that we developed could only serve people who were addicted to opioids. And in Ohio, those were primarily white people. And so people who were addicted to other substances of choice were not being served by these deflection programs. Now, a lot of things have happened since then. BJA, I think, has been responsive to that, and they've adjusted, and now we can use the funding for addiction. But it's really interesting to look in the data, and I have a local program here who I talk to, and they've started to look at their deflection data, who they deflect through these programs versus, and they're still only looking at overdoses, but they can now see that there's a horrifying, actually, increase in overdoses among young Black men in this particular community, but their deflection program isn't reaching those people, because just comparing the 2 points of data. And so now they're having a conversation about using COSAP funding to modify the program to do more effective outreach with different populations. I think it's a good example of how data can affect funding, right? Because it's that feedback loop, I think, allowed BJA to adjust kind of how they were thinking about this, but also just the importance of, like, gosh, if there's like one piece of data to track, like track race data, right? Like, I mean, really, like only one thing, but let it be that. But I think really being intentional about documenting and reviewing the data in context to make sure that what you're doing is representative.
Well, thank you. And I know, I mean, this is such a great topic, and we hit it right here at the end. But I want to be conscious of everybody's time. It is 2:31. So, I mean, if anyone has any parting thoughts, otherwise, I just wanted to say, thank you to all of you, to all of my panelists, and to PTAC, and to Frontline Responders Network. This has been really interesting. And I just wanted to let you know that there are going to be 3 more conversations coming up, 1 in March and 2 in April. So you'll obviously get notices about it, but keep your eye out. And thank you very much for your time. And I hope everyone found it interesting. Thank you.